The banker slammed the paper down so hard the ink smudged. "You have 72 hours, Harold Greer said, not even looking at her. He was already reaching for his coat. "After that, my men take the machine, the table, the chairs. Everything with your husband's name on the debt." Maeve Ashcroft stood perfectly still. She did not cry. She would not give him that. "And the boy?" she asked. Greer finally looked at her then. Something passed across his face. Not pity, not guilt. Satisfaction. "Not my problem," he said. If you have ever stood in a room where someone held your entire life in their hands and didn't care, then you already know exactly how Maeve felt in that moment. And if you've never been there, count yourself lucky. Because what came next changed everything. Not just for her, but for a town that thought it already knew her story. If this kind of story moves you, the kind where ordinary people refuse to stay down, please subscribe right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss what comes next. And while you're watching, drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Every single comment means the world to me. The morning her husband died, Maeve Ashcroft burned the biscuits. She didn't know yet, of course. She was standing at the stove with her back to the door, half listening to Owen drag his boots across the floorboards the way she'd told him 100 times not to. And she was thinking about whether the flour would last the week or only until Thursday. The biscuits caught. The smoke curled up to the ceiling. She pulled the pan off the heat and stood there looking at the blackened bottoms, and the only thing she felt in that moment was tired. 2 hours later, the mine foreman knocked on the door. She remembered afterward that she answered it with the dish rag still in her hand. That seemed important somehow, though she couldn't explain why. Like proof that she had been a normal woman doing normal things right up until the world split open. The foreman's name was Dale Purcell. He was a decent man, as far as decent men went in Harlan Creek, Montana, which wasn't saying a great deal. He took his hat off before he spoke. She noticed his hands were shaking. "Mrs. Ashcroft," he said, "there's been a collapse." She already knew from his face. She knew from the way he couldn't quite look her in the eye. She said, "How many?" Because that's what her mind reached for first. Not the grief, not yet, but the math of it. How many men? How many families standing at how many doors right now with dish rags in their hands? 11, Dale said. "Maeve, Owen's in the yard," she said. "Give me a minute." She went back inside. She set the dish rag on the counter. She folded it in half, then in half again, smoothing the edges down flat, and she stood there with her hands pressing on that folded cloth until she was sure her face would hold. Then she went to the window and watched her son chase a grasshopper through the dry grass, 6 years old and completely unaware that his life had just been cut in two. She thought, "I cannot fall apart. Not yet. Not while he can still see me." That thought became the foundation of everything that followed. She built her whole survival on top of it, sometimes so thick and so hard that she forgot it was just a thought, that underneath it she was still a 28-year-old woman who had loved her husband and was now terrifyingly alone. The first weeks after James died moved the way bad dreams move, slow and strange, with a kind of logic that only made sense inside the nightmare. Neighbors brought food. She thanked them. They offered help. She thanked them for that too. Then the food stopped coming and the help stopped being offered, because the people of Harlan Creek were not cruel, they were just practical, and they had their own winters to prepare for. The debt was the thing nobody talked to her about directly. James had borrowed against the house to buy the sewing machine, a Singer, heavy as a small horse, which he had hauled up from Billings because he believed in her skill even when she didn't. The machine was the most valuable thing they owned. It was also collateral on a loan that now, with James 3 weeks in the ground, sat on Harold Greer's desk at First Territorial Bank like a loaded rifle pointed at her door. Greer gave her 30 days before he sent the first notice, then 60. She would learn later that this was not kindness. He was simply waiting to see if she would leave on her own and spare him the paperwork. She did not leave. Instead, she sewed. She took in every piece of work she could find, shirts with missing buttons, dresses with torn seams, curtains that needed hemming. She charged fairly, and she worked late, long after Owen was asleep, her fingers going numb in the cold because she could only afford to heat one room at a time. She told herself it was enough. She told herself she was managing. She told herself a lot of things that were not quite true because the alternative was to sit in the dark and feel how close the edge actually was. Owen didn't ask about his father anymore, not after the first month. He had started doing this thing where he would stand very still in doorways, watching her, as if he were calculating whether she was all right without knowing that's what he was doing. He was 6. 6-year-olds should not be calculating anything except how far they can throw a rock or whether a frog will stay still long enough to catch. The fact that her son had started watching her with that expression, careful, measuring, too old, was the thing that scared her most. More than the debt, more than the winter. She tried to protect him from knowing how bad it was. She was not entirely successful. The day Harold Greer called her into his office for the first time, she left Owen with a neighbor's girl and walked the 4 blocks to the bank in her best dress, the black one she'd worn to the funeral, the only one without a visible mend. She sat across from Greer in a chair that was slightly too low for the desk, which she suspected was not an accident, and she listened to him explain her financial situation with the particular tone of a man who has explained many financial situations to many widows and found it tiresome. Greer was not a villain in the way that stories sometimes make men villains, all sneering and obvious malice. He was something duller, and in some ways worse. He was indifferent. He looked at Maeve Ashcroft and saw a liability, a name attached to a debt that was unlikely to resolve cleanly. His face, when he spoke to her, had the expression of a man dealing with a minor inconvenience he would prefer to be done with. "The terms were set with your husband," he said. "The loan doesn't transfer simply because—" He paused, choosing words. "Simply because circumstances have changed." "I'm aware of the terms," Maeve said. "Then you understand that we'll need to begin discussion of repayment options." "I'm making payments." He opened the ledger on his desk. "Partial payments. The interest alone, I know what the interest is, Mr. Greer." He looked at her then, for just a moment, with something that might have been mild surprise. Most widows, she imagined, cried in this chair, or went quiet, or apologized, which was the one she found most incomprehensible. Why would you apologize to the man who was about to take your livelihood? She didn't apologize. She sat straight in that too low chair, and she looked him in the eye and she said, "I need more time. I am building a business. I will make every payment." Greer closed the ledger. "Mrs. Ashcroft, I've heard that from a number of—" "I'm not a number of anything," she said, and she surprised herself with how flat and certain her voice came out. "I'm one person, and I'm telling you what I'm going to do." He gave her 60 more days. Not because he believed her, because she had not cried, and he found that mildly unsettling. The 60 days were brutal. She picked up more work, pushed harder, and let herself eat less when things ran short, so that Owen's plate stayed full. She told herself this was temporary. She told herself she had a plan. What she had, in truth, was a stubborn refusal to admit that the plan wasn't working fast enough, combined with a pride so ferocious that it had started to look from the outside like strength, when really it was just a woman too frightened to let anyone see how frightened she was. Then the letter came. She was at the machine when Owen brought it in from the front step. He was always the one who got the mail now, as if he'd appointed himself to that responsibility sometime in the months since James died. He handed it to her without a word. She looked at the bank seal in the corner and felt her stomach drop before she even opened it. Greer had moved the deadline forward. Not 60 days, 72 hours. The letter gave no explanation beyond legal language that amounted to, "The bank has reassessed its position." She would learn later that a buyer had approached Greer about acquiring several properties in the area for development, and that Maeve's house sat on a piece of land he wanted included in that deal. The timing, in other words, was not about her debt at all. It was about someone else's opportunity. But she didn't know that yet. She just sat there holding the letter while Owen watched her from the doorway with that too old expression on his face. "Mama?" he said. "It's fine," she said, "because what else do you say to a 6-year-old who is already watching you too carefully? Go wash up. We'll have supper soon." She didn't have much for supper. She scraped together a thin stew from what was left in the pantry and sat across from Owen and watched him eat and tried to think clearly about 72 hours and what they meant and what she could possibly do that she hadn't already done. The next morning, she bundled Owen into his coat and walked him with her to every business on Main Street that she hadn't already approached. The general store, the hotel, the livery, 2 of the saloons. She was not too proud for any of it. That's what she told herself. But her voice was stiff when she asked, and she could see from the way people answered that they saw the stiffness and mistook it for something else. One of the saloon owners said he was sorry, but he couldn't help her. The hotel manager said he'd think about it, and they both knew he wouldn't. The woman who ran the millinery shop was not unkind, but she had barely enough work to pay her own girl, let alone take on extra. By early afternoon, Maeve had been turned away from 8 places and had gotten one small order for a shirt repair that would cover perhaps a third of a single loan payment. Owen hadn't complained once. That was the thing that broke her open just a little. Not all the way. She wouldn't let it go all the way. But he had walked beside her all morning without a single whine, holding her hand when she let him, quiet when she needed quiet. And at some point she realized that he hadn't eaten breakfast because there hadn't been much, and she'd given him most of what there was, and still it hadn't been enough, and he hadn't said a word. They went into the second saloon toward the end of the afternoon because she'd been told the owner sometimes needed mending done on the table felt. Owen pressed close to her side when they came through the door, not frightened exactly, just close. The saloon was loud and warm and smelled of sawdust and whiskey, and Maeve stood just inside the entrance waiting for her eyes to adjust. The owner was not there. The barkeep said he'd be back in an hour. Maeve thanked him and turned to leave. That was when it happened. Owen made a sound. It wasn't a word. It wasn't even quite a cry. It was something softer and more involuntary than either of those things. A small intake of breath, and then nothing. But she felt it through his hand, where his fingers had tightened suddenly around hers, and she looked down at him, and then followed his eyes across the room. A man was eating at a corner table. Nothing remarkable about that. The plate in front of him held a steak and some kind of roasted potato and a piece of bread, and Owen was staring at it the way a child stares at something through a shop window, with a longing so naked and so complete that he hadn't even tried to hide it, because hiding it required being aware of it, and he was too hungry to be aware of anything except the fact of that food. The man at the table noticed. He looked up from his plate and looked at Owen, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then the man looked up at Maeve. She felt the heat rise immediately to her face. She tugged Owen's hand. "Come on," she said quietly. "We're going." "Ma'am," the man started. "We're fine," she said, and her voice had the same flat, clipped quality it always got when the panic was just below the surface, and she was holding it down by main force. She was already steering Owen toward the door, not running, but moving fast, because if she had to stand there one more second with that man looking at her son's face, and then looking at her with something that was probably pity, she was genuinely not sure she could hold herself together. Owen stumbled slightly at the door. She caught him. They went out into the cold. She stood on the sidewalk and took 2 long breaths and looked straight ahead at nothing. Then she looked down at Owen. His face was carefully neutral. He was already learning, already shutting things away. And that small act of self-protection in a 6-year-old boy was the most heartbreaking thing she had ever seen. "Mama," he said carefully, "I'm not really that hungry." She wanted to laugh. She wanted to sit down on the sidewalk and put her face in her hands. She did neither. She crouched down in front of him so they were eye level, and she held his face in her cold hands, and she said, "I know, baby, I know." She didn't tell him it would be fine. She had stopped making that promise because she didn't know that it would be, and some part of her, the part that was still the daughter of a woman who'd told her that respect started with telling the truth, couldn't make herself say words she wasn't sure were true. They were 1 block away when the door of the saloon opened behind them, and a voice said, "Ma'am, please wait." She stopped. She didn't turn around right away. She made herself breathe once, twice, before she did. The man from the corner table was standing on the sidewalk. He was tall and rough-looking in the way that men get who spend most of their time outdoors. Not unkempt, just worn. His coat was good quality, but old. He held his hat in one hand and he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, which was unusual because she had gotten very good at reading men's expressions in the months since James died. Most of them were easy: pity, impatience, dismissal, or the particular uncomfortable guilt of someone who knows they could help and has decided not to. This one was different. He didn't look guilty. He didn't look like he was performing anything. He just looked like a man who had seen something and was deciding what to do about it. "I've got more food than I can finish," he said. "That's the honest truth of it. And your boy is welcome to share the table if you'd let him. No charity, just a waste of a good steak otherwise." She looked at him for a long moment. Owen's hand was very still in hers. "We don't need," she started. "Mama." Owen's voice was barely above a whisper. He wasn't asking, he wasn't whining, he was just saying her name. But the way he said it was its own kind of sentence. She looked down at her son. She looked back at the man. "Your name," she said. "Colton Briggs," he said. "I run the Briggs outfit about 12 miles north. You're Maeve Ashcroft." He said it matter-of-factly, not like he'd been asking around, but like Harlan Creek was small enough that he simply knew. "I heard about James. I'm sorry." She held herself very still. She hated condolences. They always felt like something people said to make themselves feel better about not doing anything. But the way he said it, short, direct, not dressed up with sentiment, didn't feel like that. It felt like a man stating a fact he wished weren't true. "Thank you," she said. They looked at each other for another second. The cold wind moved down the street between them. "Well," he said quietly, and he looked at Owen. "What do you say, son?" Owen looked up at his mother. His chin was doing something complicated. He was holding himself together the same way she was. She could see it, the effort of it, and it wrecked her completely that her 6-year-old had learned that from watching her. She took a breath. "All right," she said, and the 2 words cost her more than anything she'd spent all year. They went back inside. Owen ate. He ate slowly at first, watching her for permission, then less slowly, and then he put his head down and ate like a child who had been hungry for a long time and couldn't pretend otherwise. Maeve sat across from Colton Briggs and drank the coffee he ordered for her without asking and tried to look like a woman who did this kind of thing all the time and not like a woman who was holding herself together by the thinnest of threads. Colton didn't press her to talk. He ate what was left of his steak and looked out the window occasionally and said nothing that required an answer. It was the most considerate thing anyone had done for her in months, and she hated how much she needed it. When Owen's plate was clean, he looked up with color in his face for the first time since morning. "Thank you," he said to Colton. His voice was formal, the way children's voices get when they've been taught their manners carefully. "Good?" Colton asked. Owen nodded. Something moved across Colton's face. Not sentimentality, something quieter than that. Like a door that had been almost closed had opened just a crack. Maeve set down her coffee. "We should go," she said. "Mrs. Ashcroft." Colton looked at her directly. Not through her, not past her. At her, the way people had mostly stopped doing since James died. "I know you didn't come looking for help, but I've got 20 men on my payroll and every one of them needs work done on their gear before winter. Saddle blankets, canvas, coats. Half of it is past mending by most people's standards, but I suspect not by yours." He paused. "Fair wages for the work. You'd be doing me the favor." She looked at him. "You don't need to—" "I know I don't," he said. "I'm asking because it's a practical arrangement, nothing more than that." She looked at his face for signs of the thing she dreaded most. The condescension dressed up as generosity, the charity that wanted to be thanked. She didn't find it. His face was steady and plain and a little tired, the face of a man who said what he meant because he didn't have the energy for anything more complicated. The letter from Greer was in her coat pocket. 72 hours, ticking down. She thought about pride. She thought about Owen's face over that plate of food. She thought about the singer sitting in her front room, the machine James had hauled up from Billings because he believed in her. "Fair wages," she repeated. "Same as I'd pay any craftsman," he said. "Not more, not less." She picked up her coffee and drank the last of it and set the cup down. "I'll come by the ranch on Thursday," she said. "With Owen, if that's agreeable. He's no trouble." "No trouble at all," Colton said. She stood, helped Owen into his coat, and buttoned it to the top the way she always did, even though he was old enough to do it himself, because some habits were just hers to keep. Then she looked at Colton Briggs one more time. "I work well," she said. Not bragging, just information. "I know," he said. "That's why I asked." She walked out into the cold with her son's hand in hers, and she did not let herself feel hope yet, because hope was the thing that could undo her faster than anything else. But somewhere beneath the careful, armored surface of her, something had shifted, something small and fragile and important. She told herself it was just a business arrangement. She was not entirely wrong, but she was not entirely right either, and that, in the end, would turn out to matter more than she knew. Thursday came faster than she expected, which was the way time moved when you were dreading something. Not slowly, the way people said, but in a rush, like it wanted to get the hard part over with. Maeve was up before dawn. She pressed her second-best dress, the gray one with the small collar, and she laid out Owen's clothes the night before so there'd be no argument in the morning. There was no argument. Owen was already awake when she came to get him, sitting on the edge of his bed with his boots in his lap, trying to work the left one on by himself. He'd gotten the right one wrong, tongue twisted sideways, laces hanging. But he didn't ask for help. She knelt and fixed it without comment, and he let her, and neither of them said anything about it. She had the small bag packed with her thread, her scissors, her needles, and the good thimble that had been her mother's. She'd also brought a spare spool of heavy-gauge thread she suspected would be needed for canvas work. She'd thought about it the night before, lying awake, turning over what Colton had said. Saddle blankets, canvas, coats. That was outdoor work. That was different from the fine stuff, the shirt seams and curtain hems she'd been living on. Heavier. Harder on the hands. She could do it. She'd done it before, when James was alive and they'd patched the wagon cover together on a Sunday afternoon, her stitching while he held the canvas flat and complained about how long it was taking. She had smiled at that memory, alone in the dark. Then she'd stopped smiling because smiling at memories of James still felt like pressing on a bruise. She did it anyway sometimes, just to know it was still there. The ride out to the Briggs Ranch took the better part of an hour. She'd borrowed the neighbor girl's father's cart, a favor she'd have to repay somehow, and she drove it herself because she was capable of that, and because it seemed important to arrive at Colton Briggs's property under her own steam. Owen sat beside her on the bench and watched the land open up around them, the dry grass going silver in the early light, the mountains sitting blue and remote in the distance, and for a while he looked like a child again instead of a small worried adult, and she was grateful for that. The Briggs Ranch was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said exactly what she had expected. It was a working place. Everything about it said that. The fence lines, tight and maintained. The barn, large and practical without being showy. The house itself, solid and plain, not painted, weathered to the color of old bone. There were men moving around the yard already, doing morning tasks with the efficient quiet of people who did the same things every day and didn't need to think about them anymore. Colton came out of the barn when he heard the cart. He was dressed for work, heavy shirt, worn gloves tucked in his belt. And he looked at Maeve and then at Owen and nodded once like the arrangement had been settled and there was no need to make anything of it. "Mrs. Ashcroft," he said. Then to Owen, "You know anything about horses?" Owen looked up at his mother. She gave the smallest nod. "Some," Owen said carefully. "That's enough," Colton said. "Come on." And just like that, Owen was gone, walking beside this large, quiet man toward the barn. And Maeve stood in the yard holding her bag of supplies and felt the ground shift slightly under her feet. Not in a bad way exactly. More like the way the floor feels when you've been on a boat and you step back onto land. Solid, but different from what your body had gotten used to. One of the ranch hands, a young man with a sunburned forehead and the cautious manner of someone who has been told to be helpful, showed her to a work table in a side room off the main barn. It was a good space, not fancy, but with decent light from 2 windows and enough room to spread the canvas out flat. There was already a pile of work waiting for her. She looked at it and felt something settle inside her chest, something that might have been relief or might have been purpose. They felt similar enough that she sometimes couldn't tell the difference anymore. She got to work. The first piece was a saddle blanket that had separated along 2 seams and been badly repaired at least once before with thread that wasn't the right weight. She pulled the old repair out, examined the damage, chose her thread, and started over. Her hands knew what to do. That was the thing about skill. It didn't require you to be in a good mood or to believe in yourself or to be anything other than present. Her hands just did the thing they knew, and the rest of her quieted down enough to let them. An hour in, she heard Owen laugh. It came from outside through the window, and it caught her so off guard that she stopped mid-stitch. She hadn't heard that sound, that particular sound, loose and unguarded, a laugh that didn't know it was being listened to, in a long time. She didn't know exactly when it had stopped. Sometime in the months after James died, the real laughs had gotten quieter and then gone mostly silent, replaced by the smaller, more careful sounds a child makes when he's monitoring his own noise level around a grieving parent. She made herself go back to her stitching. But she was smiling, just slightly, and she didn't try to stop that. By the time the morning was half gone, she'd repaired the saddle blanket, 2 work shirts, and had made a solid start on a canvas cover that had been ripped along its entire south-facing edge. The ranch hand with the sunburned forehead had come by twice, once to bring coffee, which she accepted, and once to ask if she needed anything else, which she didn't. He seemed faintly amazed by the speed of the work, which she found both flattering and slightly irritating, because why wouldn't she be fast? She'd been doing this her whole life. Colton appeared at the door around midday. He looked at the pile of completed work, and then at the canvas spread across the table, and then at her, and he said nothing for a moment. "You brought the right thread for the canvas," he said. "Heavy gauge. I guessed you'd need it." "That's the right guess." He leaned in the doorway. He didn't come all the way in. She'd noticed that about him already. He was careful about space, about not crowding. "Hungry?" She thought about saying no. She almost said no out of pure reflex. Then she stopped herself because the coffee had been hot and real, and she hadn't eaten since a piece of bread at dawn, and there was no virtue in refusing food when there was food to be had, and the only reason she wanted to refuse was pride, which was not the same thing as dignity, no matter how much she'd been treating it that way. "Yes," she said. The meal was eaten at a long wooden table in the cookhouse, she and Owen and 4 of the ranch hands and Colton, all of them eating the same thing, beans and salt pork and cornbread, no ceremony about it. Owen sat between her and a broad-shouldered man named Reuben, who had a scar across his chin and talked to Owen about horses, with the grave seriousness of someone discussing matters of great importance. Owen listened with his whole body, the way he used to listen to James. She ate and didn't say much and watched, and she thought, this is what it looks like when a place is actually being run. Not show, not performance, just people doing the thing they came to do, taking care of what needed taking care of, sitting down to eat because the body required it, and then going back to work. It had been a long time since she'd sat at a table that felt like this. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed it until right now, and that realization arrived with a small edge of pain, which she quietly put aside and did not look at directly. After lunch, Owen disappeared again with Reuben, who had apparently promised to show him how to clean a saddle properly. Maeve went back to the work table. Colton came by an hour later with a second pile of items from the hands who'd heard she was there. A jacket with a split shoulder seam, a pair of heavy gloves that needed a new cuff, a vest with all 4 buttons missing. She looked at the pile. "They'll pay you directly," Colton said. "Same rate. I told them you weren't a charity service." She looked up at him quickly. "You told them that? Was I wrong to?" She considered. "No," she said. "You weren't wrong." He nodded. He started to leave. "Colton." She said his name without thinking about it, and then noticed she'd done it and kept going because stopping would have made it strange. "Why did you—" She stopped. Rearranged. "Most men in your position would have thrown some work my way and called it charity and felt good about themselves. Why didn't you do that?" He turned back and looked at her with that steady, hard-to-read expression she was starting to recognize. "Because you'd have quit after one day," he said, "and then where would I be with all this canvas?" It was so plainly stated and so unexpectedly accurate that she didn't know quite what to do with it. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but almost, and looked back down at the jacket in her hands. "Thursday next?" she said. "And the one after that," he said, "if the work holds up." "The work will hold up." "I know," he said. "Again, just information." And he left. The work held up. It did more than hold up. By the second week, word had gotten to the Halverson Ranch 6 miles east, and a man showed up at Maeve's door on a Tuesday morning with a pile of gear that needed attention before the season turned. She looked at the pile. She looked at the man. She named a price. He agreed without negotiating, which told her she'd priced it too low, so she filed that information away for next time. By the 3rd week, she'd gotten work from 2 more operations, both of them neighbors of the Briggs Ranch, and she understood then that Colton had said something to somebody. She didn't know what exactly. She hadn't asked him, and he hadn't volunteered it. But the work was coming from the right direction, which was his direction, and it was coming with a specific quality of matter-of-factness that told her he'd presented it as practical business and not as a favor to a widow woman, and she was so grateful for that distinction that she couldn't quite bring herself to be irritated at him for doing it without asking. She was getting close to being irritated anyway, just on principle. Owen, meanwhile, was spending 2 days a week at the Briggs Ranch. This had happened gradually, without any formal arrangement. He had simply started coming with her on Thursdays, and then Colton had mentioned there was work to be done clearing the north pasture fence, and had asked, carefully, whether Owen might like to help. And Owen had looked at his mother with something so raw and hopeful in his face that she'd said yes before she'd finished thinking about whether it was wise. Owen came home those evenings tired in a clean way. Not the gray exhaustion of a child carrying worry, but the good red tiredness of a child who has used his body for something real. He ate more. He slept hard. He stopped standing in doorways watching her. She noticed all of it. She kept her feelings about it at a careful distance because they were complicated feelings, and she didn't have time for complicated right now. The money was not yet enough. That was the truth she carried underneath the daily business of working and managing Owen and repaying the small social debts she'd accumulated in the bad months. The payments to the bank were being made. She was making them, on time, the full amount. But the debt itself was deep, and she could feel Greer's attention on her like a cold hand on the back of her neck. She told herself she was making progress. She was. But progress and safety were not the same thing, and she knew it, and it kept her awake more nights than she liked. It was a Monday evening in the 5th week. She remembered it was a Monday because she'd just finished the mending for the hotel that she did every Monday. And she was tired in that specific bone-deep way of someone who has been going hard for too long without a real rest. When she came out of the kitchen and found Owen sitting at the small table by the window with a piece of paper and a pencil, writing something in his careful, not yet certain hand. "What are you doing?" she said. "Writing a letter," he said, without looking up. "To who?" He put the pencil down and looked at her with an expression that was both earnest and slightly guilty. "To Mr. Briggs," he said, "to say thank you, because you always say I should write thank you letters, and I haven't yet." She stood very still. "Where did you learn his address?" "You wrote it in your workbook," Owen said, "for the invoices." She looked at her son for a long moment. He looked back at her, not flinching, holding his ground the way he did when he thought he was right. He was right. He should write thank you letters. She was the one who told him that. "Finish it," she said. "Then come show me before you seal it." He nodded and picked up his pencil. She went back to the kitchen and stood at the counter for a minute doing nothing, which was something she almost never did. The letter Owen wrote was 4 sentences long. It thanked Colton for teaching him about horses. It said he had learned that you should always approach from the left side and talk before you touch. It said he hoped the ranch was doing well. It was signed in the careful blocky letters of a child working hard at neatness, Owen James Ashcroft. She read it twice. She handed it back. She did not say anything about the fact that he'd used his middle name, which was James's name, the way he sometimes did when he was trying to make something feel important. "It's good," she said. "Seal it." The letter arrived at the Briggs Ranch on a Wednesday. She knew because Colton mentioned it on Thursday, briefly, the way he mentioned most things, without building toward it or making anything of it. "Got Owen's letter," he said, handing her a fresh pile of canvas work. "He should have written sooner," she said. "He wrote when he meant it," Colton said. "That's better than sooner." She didn't answer that. She started unpacking her bag. "He's a good boy," Colton said. It was not the empty thing people usually said about children. He said it the way he said things about horses or fence lines, as an assessment he'd made and was confident in. "I know he is," she said quietly. They worked in a companionable silence after that, which was something she'd stopped finding strange around the 4th Thursday. Colton didn't fill silence for the sake of filling it, and neither did she, and they had discovered this about each other without discussing it. The way you discover things about people when you spend enough time in the same room doing real work. It was the following Tuesday that everything started to go wrong. She was in the middle of a coat repair, a heavy wool coat from the Halverson Ranch, the lining completely separated from the shell, when the knock came at the front door. She set the coat down and went to answer it, already cataloging in her head whether this was a delivery or a new order or something else. And when she opened the door and saw the young man from First Territorial Bank, she knew from his face that it was something else. He handed her an envelope. He didn't quite meet her eyes. He said, "Mr. Greer asked me to deliver this personally, ma'am." And then he left fast, which was how you knew it was bad news. The messenger always left fast. She stood in the doorway and opened the envelope. The bank had completed a formal review of her account, based on the irregular payment history in the earlier months. The partial payments, the late ones, back before the work with Colton had started, Greer had reclassified her loan as high risk. As a result, the bank was invoking an acceleration clause. The full remaining balance of the loan was now due within 45 days. Not the regular payment, the whole balance. Everything still owed. She read it twice. Then she went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and read it a third time, because her brain kept wanting the words to mean something different. The full balance was more than she would earn in 8 months at her current rate. Probably 10 months. She did the arithmetic in her head quickly, the way she'd learned to do it in the bad months when arithmetic was the thing standing between her and panic. The numbers did not improve with repetition. She set the letter on the table. She put her hands flat on either side of it. She looked at the wall. The machine sat in the corner of the room, solid and heavy and completely indifferent to her situation, which was what machines were. They didn't care whether you were managing or drowning. They just waited. She thought about James. She thought about the look on his face when he'd walked in the door that day with the singer crated on the wagon bed, grinning like a man who'd done something wonderful, which he had. She thought about how she'd scolded him for the cost, and then cried a little when she'd first sat down at it and put her foot on the treadle and felt the power of it, the potential of it, and he'd leaned in the doorway. The way Colton leaned in doorways, she noticed now, which was just something certain kinds of men did, and said, "See? I told you." She thought about how she'd never told him that she still thought about that moment, that she never got to tell him. She put that away. She needed to think about 45 days. Owen came in from the yard 20 minutes later, and she had herself back together enough by then that she folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket before he could see it. She asked him how the grasshoppers were. He said there weren't as many as last week. She said that was probably because it was getting colder. He said he thought they probably went somewhere warm. She said probably. She made supper. She listened to him talk. She did not let anything she was feeling show on her face. After he was in bed, she got the letter back out and sat with it at the table with the lamp burning low. 45 days. She turned the problem over and over. There were no angles she hadn't looked at. She couldn't borrow against anything. There was nothing left to borrow against. She couldn't accelerate the work enough to cover the gap in 45 days. Not by a margin that would matter. She could go to Greer and ask for an extension, which she'd already done twice, and she knew from the cool regularity of his recent correspondence that the window for those conversations had quietly closed. She sat there for a long time. Then she folded the letter again, very precisely, along the same creases it had come with, and she set it in the box where she kept the important papers, and she went to bed because there was work in the morning, and she could not think her way through this tonight, and there was no use burning the lamp over it. She lay awake for 2 hours. That was all. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing, lying in the dark with the cold seeping in around the window frame and Owen breathing steadily in the next room, was that Colton Briggs was also awake at that hour, for reasons that were entirely his own. He had a man in town, not a spy, nothing as deliberate as that, just someone who managed supplies for the ranch and who moved through Harlan Creek the way people do when they're connected enough to hear things. This man had mentioned, in passing, that Greer had reclassified a number of accounts recently, that one of them was the Ashcroft account, that the acceleration clause had been invoked. Colton had sat with that information all evening. He sat with it the way he sat with most problems, quietly, from multiple angles, without rushing toward a conclusion. He was not an impulsive man. He had built what he'd built by moving carefully and not letting anger push him faster than sense. But something in him was not being governed by sense right now. He thought about Owen's letter sitting on his desk. He thought about the look on that boy's face the afternoon he'd shown him how to talk to a horse before you touched it. The absolute concentrated attention of a child encountering something new and finding it completely absorbing, finding the world opening up a little instead of closing in. He thought about Maeve at the work table, her hands moving without hesitation, her spine straight, her face doing that thing it did when she was deep in the work and not performing anything for anyone, just present, just real. He thought about what Greer was doing and why, and he was fairly sure he understood the why, because he'd heard about the land buyer and he understood how these things worked, and the understanding made something hard and cold settle in the center of his chest. He made a decision. He was not certain it was the right one. He made it anyway, because doing nothing also had consequences, and he'd spent enough of his life watching people do nothing while they waited to be sure. He would go to the bank in the morning. He would speak to Greer. He would make an arrangement. He did not tell Maeve. This was the mistake, the one that would cost him, the one he would spend a long time afterward understanding and being accountable for. But in the moment, sitting in the dark with the decision just made and the cold quiet of the ranch around him, his reasoning was simple and felt solid. She was already carrying too much. He could take this one thing. He would do it cleanly, and she wouldn't have to fight this particular battle, and that would be that. He was wrong about all of it, except the intention. But intentions, as Maeve Ashcroft could have told him, were not the same as results. And she would tell him, at considerable volume. But that was still a few days away. In the morning, Colton rode into Harlan Creek and walked into First Territorial Bank at 8:15, before most people were on the street, and he asked to see Harold Greer. Greer kept him waiting 12 minutes, which Colton understood was a choice. When he was finally shown in, he sat across the desk from the banker, in that same slightly too low chair, though it affected him differently than it affected a young widow woman, because he was a large man and didn't feel small in low chairs. And he looked at Greer and stated, without preamble, what he was proposing. He would co-sign on the Ashcroft debt. Not pay it. Co-sign. Guarantee it. His ranch and land as additional collateral. The loan terms would revert to the original schedule, the acceleration clause voided, the high-risk reclassification removed from the account. Greer listened. He didn't react immediately, which was his habit. He looked at some papers on his desk. He looked at Colton. "Your interest in this matter?" he said finally. "She does quality work for my operation," Colton said. "I have a practical interest in her business continuing." Greer picked up his pen. "And Mrs. Ashcroft is aware of this proposal?" There was a half-second pause, half a second too long. Greer looked up. "She'll be informed," Colton said. Greer looked at him for a moment with something that might have been professional amusement. "I see," he said. He set the pen down. "Mr. Briggs, I'm going to be direct with you. This bank will accept your co-signature. The terms will be as you've stated. I'll have the documents drawn up by end of week." He paused. "I'd suggest informing Mrs. Ashcroft before she receives documentation with your name on it. In my experience, widows tend to have specific feelings about financial arrangements made on their behalf without their knowledge." "I'm aware," Colton said, though he wasn't. Not really. Not in the way Greer meant it. He rode back to the ranch. He told himself he'd done the right thing. He was still telling himself that when Friday came and he went to collect some finished work from Maeve, and he was partway through saying it, not the decision itself but leading up to it, trying to find the words. When she set down the coat she was repairing and looked at him with a stillness that was not calm at all. "Say that again," she said. He said it again. The stillness lasted about 4 more seconds. Then Maeve Ashcroft put her hands flat on the work table, and she looked at him, and she said with a quiet fury that was far more effective than shouting would have been, "You went to that man, behind my back, and you made a deal about my debt. My debt. My name on that loan. You did that without asking me. I was trying to—" "I know what you were trying to do," she said, "and I'm telling you what you actually did. You went around me. Like I was something to be managed. Like I was a problem you could just—" She stopped. She was shaking slightly, and it was clearly not fear. "That is my business, Colton. That loan is my name. That machine in that corner has my dead husband's faith in me attached to it, and you had no right—" "Maeve, don't." Just the one word. Very flat. Very certain. He stopped. She looked at him for a long time. Her jaw was set and her eyes were bright, and she was the most formidable thing he'd seen in a long time. And some part of him, underneath the growing understanding that he had badly miscalculated, registered that fact with something close to respect. "Get the documents voided," she said. "Tell Greer the arrangement is off." "That puts you back where you were," he said, "with 45 days and no way to—" "I know where it puts me," she said. "That's my problem to solve, not yours." He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them moved. "Will you at least let me—" He stopped. Reconsidered, said it differently. "Will you tell me what you need to solve it? Not what I should do. What you need." That question, the specific way he'd shaped it, the distinction he'd drawn, landed differently than she'd expected it to. She could see it registering in her face before she'd decided how to feel about it. She didn't answer right away. She picked up the coat and set it on the table in front of her and smoothed it flat with her hands, not to work on it, just to have something to do with her hands while she thought. What did she need? Not his money, not his name on her debt, not someone stepping in front of her and taking the blow she'd been bracing for because some part of him couldn't watch her take it. What she needed, what she had always needed, since the morning the foreman knocked on her door and she folded the dish rag into neat squares to hold herself together, was not to be managed, was to be in the room where decisions got made about her life. Was for the people around her to believe she was capable of making those decisions, even when the margin was thin and the clock was running. She looked at him. What I need, she said slowly, is for Greer to see that this is a real business, not a widow's charity case, not a debt that needs a man's name backing it up. A business. With contracts. With income he can count. Something that proves that loan will be repaid from my work, not from your good name. Colton was quiet. He was thinking. She could see him thinking. The ranches, he said, the ones sending you work. If they signed contracts, actual long-term commitments, not just orders, that's documented income. That's something a bank looks at. I know what it is, she said. The question is whether I can get enough of them signed fast enough to matter. How many would you need? She did the arithmetic. She'd been doing it in her head since the letter arrived, in different configurations, looking for a version that worked. 7, she said, maybe 8, long-term enough to show the loan gets covered. I know 7 ranch operations that trust your work, he said. She looked at him. I'm not asking you to call in favors for me. I'm not talking about favors, he said. I'm talking about the truth. They trust your work because they've seen it. All I'd be doing is asking them to put that in writing. He paused. You can come with me. Every conversation, every ranch, you do the asking. I'm just the one who knows where the door is. She stared at him. The fury was still there, in the back of it, because it didn't just go away because someone said something right. But underneath it, something else was working. Something pragmatic and clear-eyed that had gotten very good at separating what she felt from what she needed to do. You void the co-signature first, she said. Done, he said. And you tell Greer nothing until I'm ready to walk in there myself. Also done. And next time, she said, and her voice was still flat, still hard at the edges. If you're thinking about making any arrangement that has my name in it, you talk to me first, every time. Do you understand that? He looked at her without flinching. Yes, he said. I do. And I'm sorry, Maeve. I was wrong. He said it straight. No hedging, no explanation wrapped around it to soften the accountability. Just the admission, placed down on the table between them like something he meant for her to pick up and keep. She picked it up. She didn't say it was fine, because it wasn't, not entirely. But she also didn't hold it against him any longer than it deserved. Thursday, she said. We start with the Halverson Ranch. He nodded. He picked up his hat. He walked to the door, and at the door he paused. That particular pause she'd started to recognize, the one that meant he had one more thing and was deciding whether to say it. What? She said. Nothing, he said. Thursday. He left. She stood in the quiet for a moment, alone with the coat and the letter in the box and the machine in the corner, and she let herself feel the full weight of what was still in front of her, not to wallow in it, but because ignoring the weight didn't make it lighter. She had 45 days. She had a plan that required 7 signed contracts from ranch families she'd earned the trust of, which was not nothing, but was also not guaranteed. She had a man who had made a serious mistake and then admitted it without dressing it up, which in her experience was rarer than it should have been. She had her hands and her work, and Owen sleeping in the next room, and the singer sitting heavy and solid in the corner, and James's faith in her built right into the thing, and she was not going to lose any of it without putting up the best fight she had in her. She sat back down and picked up the coat and found her needle and went back to the lining. There was still work to finish before the end of the day. The Halverson Ranch sat on a long, flat stretch of land east of the Briggs operation, and getting there required crossing a creek that had gone low but not dry, which meant the cartwheels came through muddy, and Owen spent the first 10 minutes of the ride picking at the dried clumps on the running board until Maeve told him to stop. It was early. The sun was still low and pale, doing very little about the cold. She had the folder of paperwork on her lap. Not contracts yet, because there were no contracts yet. Just blank forms she'd written up herself at the kitchen table the night before, working from memory of what real business agreements looked like based on the few she'd seen in her life. She was not a lawyer. The forms were not perfect, but they were clear. They stated amounts and timelines, and they had lines at the bottom for signatures, and sometimes that was what mattered most. Having something solid to put in front of a person, something that said, "I am taking this seriously, and I expect you to also." Colton drove. He'd offered, and she hadn't argued because she needed her hands free to review the papers, and also because she was conserving energy for what was ahead. They hadn't talked much since Thursday. Not coldly. The anger had settled into something more workable, a kind of cautious mutual respect that was aware of its own fragility. She hadn't forgotten what he'd done. She also hadn't forgotten that he'd admitted it cleanly, and then shown up Thursday morning with his hat in his hand and a list of 7 ranch families written on a folded piece of paper, and that this was not nothing. Owen sat between them on the bench. He'd been told this morning that they were going on a business trip, which had made him sit up straighter in a way that would have made her smile on a less anxious day. "What do I do?" he'd asked. "You be polite," she'd told him. "You shake hands if anyone offers. You don't touch anything that doesn't belong to you. And if you don't know what to say nothing. That's always better than saying the wrong thing." He had absorbed all of this with the same grave concentration he'd given to horse training, which made her think he was going to be either a very good businessman or a very good horseman, and either way she was probably going to be all right. Lars Halvorsen was a big Scandinavian man in his late 50s who had come to Montana from Minnesota 20 years ago and built his operation through a combination of hard work and an absolute refusal to be beaten by the climate, which she respected. His wife, Dora, was small and sharp-eyed, and had once complimented Maeve stitching on a tablecloth at a church social 2 years before James died, which was the kind of detail Maeve had filed away and never mentioned. Halvorsen met them in the yard. He shook Colton's hand and then, without hesitation, shook Maeve's, which she noted. Not all men did that first. Some waited to see if she'd offer her hand or just nod. Halvorsen didn't wait. She filed that away too. They went inside because Dora insisted, which Maeve had hoped for. Kitchens were better than yards for this kind of conversation, warmer and more human, and Dora Halvorsen turned out to be the kind of woman who poured coffee and sat down at the table herself instead of disappearing into the back of the house, which meant she was someone whose opinion mattered here. Maeve aimed some of her conversation directly at Dora, which she could see Halvorsen noticed and appreciated. She explained the situation plainly. Not all of it. Not the acceleration clause, not the 45 days, not the thing with the land buyer and what she suspected Greer was doing. Just the business part. She had a growing operation, she had documented work, and she was looking to establish formal long-term contracts with ranch families she'd already been working with, to formalize what had been informal arrangements and create a stable foundation going forward. "What would the terms be?" Halvorsen asked. She told him. She'd thought about this carefully. The rate was fair. Not cheap, not inflated, but the honest price of skilled labor performed reliably, which was the argument she was making with the number itself. The commitment was 18 months. The schedule was flexible based on seasonal demand. Halvorsen looked at the paper. He was quiet for a moment, which was the kind of quiet that meant he was actually reading it, not just waiting to respond, which she appreciated. "Your work on the canvas cover held through the last 2 weeks of rain," he said, not looking up. "No seam separation. Reuben said it was the best repair he'd seen on that piece in 10 years. "Reuben's right," she said. Dora made a sound that might have been a suppressed smile. Halvorsen set the paper down. He looked at her. "I'll sign it," he said, but I want a clause that if the quality drops below what I've been getting, I can renegotiate the rate." "That's fair," she said, and meant it, because it was. She wrote the clause in her own hand, right there at the table, and he watched her do it and nodded. He signed. Dora signed as witness, which nobody had asked her to do but which she did anyway, and Maeve thought she might actually like this woman. 1. The next ranch was the Connolly operation, 12 miles north, which required backtracking past the Briggs place and then heading up a road that was more of a suggestion than an actual road. Patrick Connolly was 32 and newly married and running a small outfit he'd inherited from his uncle, and he was the kind of young man who tried to seem more certain than he was, which meant the conversation required a slightly different approach. With Halverson, she'd led with the quality of the work. With Connolly, she led with the economics. He was young, he was watching every dollar, and she could see from the state of the ranch house that things were tight. She showed him the math, what he'd paid her in the last 6 weeks on individual orders, what that same amount covered under the contract, the money he'd save on per-piece pricing by committing to volume. She also mentioned, without making a big thing of it, that under a contract arrangement she could prioritize his work in the rotation, which meant faster turnaround during the busy season when everyone needed repairs at once. He asked 3 questions. She answered all of them directly. He signed. 2. Between the second and third ranch, they ate in the cart, bread and dried meat that Maeve had packed that morning, because stopping at a place for a meal felt like using up goodwill she needed for the actual conversation. Owen ate without complaint, though she could see him eyeing the last piece of bread for longer than was polite. She gave it to him without comment. He took it without pretending he hadn't been looking at it, which she respected. "You're good at this," Colton said. She looked at him. "At what?" "Talking to them. You read each one differently." "I've been watching people decide things my whole life," she said. "You learn the difference between a man who needs the facts and a man who needs to feel certain. They're not always the same person." He was quiet for a moment. "Halverson needed both," he said. "Halverson needed to know the work was real, and that I respected his intelligence enough to give him terms he could push back on." She folded the paper from the bread. "Some men will only trust an arrangement they've negotiated, even if what they end up with is exactly what you offered in the first place." Colton looked at her sideways. "Is that what you do with Greer?" "Greer's different," she said. "Greer doesn't need to feel certain. He needs to feel powerful. That's a harder problem." She looked out at the road ahead. The mountains were higher here, closer, and the cold had teeth in it now that the sun had gone behind a bank of cloud. She thought about what came after the contracts, the walk into the bank, the folder in her hands, the conversation she'd have to have with Greer when she had everything in order. She'd been thinking about that conversation for 3 days, running it forward and backward in her mind, finding the holes in her argument and filling them with evidence. The thing about Greer was that he wasn't unreasonable in the way that cruel people were unreasonable. He was reasonable in the way that made him harder to fight. He simply didn't care. He applied the rules he had, followed the logic of his ledger, and called that fairness. The only way to reach him was through the same logic, to make the ledger say something different than it currently said. That was what the contracts were for, not to appeal to his humanity, to appeal to his arithmetic. The third ranch was the Peterson place, run by a woman, which Maeve had not known when they'd set out that morning, but discovered when they arrived and found a lean, dark-haired woman of about 40 named Clara Peterson running the operation mostly alone, her husband being in poor health and unable to work for the past year. Clara Peterson looked at Maeve for a long moment when she arrived, and then looked at Colton and then back at Maeve, and something passed between the two women that didn't require words. The particular recognition of one person in a specific kind of difficulty for another. "You came to ask me to sign something," Clara said. Not a question. "Yes," Maeve said. "Work contract. You've had repairs from me before." "Belt, 2 blankets, a coat," Clara said, confirming her memory was good. "All held." She tilted her head slightly. "Why now? Why formal?" Maeve looked at her steadily. "Because I need documented income," she said. "The bank needs to see that what I'm doing is a business and not luck." Clara was quiet. Then she said, "Greer?" "Greer," Maeve said. Clara Peterson made a sound low in her throat that was not polite and picked up the pen. 3. And 3 more before the day was done. The Mac outfit, the old Sorensen place now run by a nephew, and a man named Tully, who raised sheep instead of cattle, and whose gear needs were different from most, but who had been sending Maeve work since the 2nd month, and who signed the paper without reading it very carefully, which she made him do before she accepted the signature. "Read it," she said when he'd reached for the pen. He looked at her, slightly surprised. "Please," she added, and waited, because she was not going to have anyone come back later and say they hadn't understood what they'd signed, Not when these papers were the foundation of something she couldn't afford to have crack. 6 signed by late afternoon. She needed 7. The 7th ranch, the McGraw place, was another 40 minutes up the road, and the light was already going gray. "We could come back tomorrow," Colton said. "I'd rather not," she said. "The week's running, and I don't want to lose the momentum." She paused. "Also, I told Owen we'd be back for supper." From between them, Owen said, without looking up from the stone he'd been turning over in his hands for the last hour, "I don't mind." "You don't get a vote," she said, not unkindly. "Okay," he said. And then, after a moment, "But I really don't mind." She looked down at him. He looked up at her with that expression, that open, earnest, I'm trying to help expression, and something happened in the center of her chest that she decided not to examine too carefully. 40 minutes, she said to Colton. The McGraw place was the hardest conversation of the day. Roy McGraw was 64 and had worked the same land for 30 years and had opinions about how things should be done that were based entirely on how things had always been done, which meant that the concept of a formal written contract with a woman for ongoing repair work required some arriving at. He wasn't hostile. He was just slow to move, the way certain men were. Not from stupidity, but from a kind of deep-rooted wariness of new arrangements that had been calcified by decades of watching new arrangements go wrong. He asked questions. Many of them. Some of them twice. Maeve answered each one the same way she'd answered the first time, without visible impatience, because impatience was a luxury she couldn't afford today. She was aware of the light outside the window fading steadily, of Owen sitting in the corner on a wooden chair that was slightly too tall for him, his legs hanging, not complaining, not fidgeting very much, just waiting. After 45 minutes, Roy McGraw said, "I suppose this makes sense," with the air of a man conceding something he'd been planning to concede for the last 20 minutes, and had needed to satisfy himself he'd examined from every angle first. He signed. 7. She sat in the cart on the way back with the folder on her lap and the signed papers inside it, and she felt something she was almost afraid to name. Not triumph, it was too soon for that, but something solid, something with weight, like the difference between standing on ice and standing on ground. She'd done it in one day, 7 ranches, 7 signatures. Her hands were cold, and her back ached from the cart, and she was tired in the specific way that came from being performing and precise and careful for 8 hours straight, which was different from the tiredness of physical work. More draining in some ways. Harder to sleep off. Owen had fallen asleep against her arm somewhere around the halfway point of the ride back. She let him stay there and adjusted her arm slightly so his head wouldn't slide, and she held the folder in her other hand and looked out at the dark land and the cold sky, and she thought about what came next. The appointment with Greer. She'd have to ask for one, which was already an indignity she was bracing for. The waiting, the low chair, the expression on his face. She went through the conversation in her head again. Where he'd push back. What he'd say. What she'd say. Colton was quiet for most of the ride. He'd been good today. Genuinely useful in ways that didn't diminish her, knowing when to speak and when to stay back, introducing her when they arrived, and then stepping away from the conversation so it was clearly hers. She'd noticed that and was going to say something about it at some point. Not now. She was too tired now. "Thank you," she said when they were close enough to Harlan Creek that the lights were visible in the distance. He glanced at her. "For what?" "For today. For—" She stopped, sorted through the words. "For knowing when not to talk." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not always good at that." "No," she agreed. "But you were today." He nodded. He looked back at the road. 7 is enough? He asked. 7 should be enough. I've calculated it 3 different ways. It covers the loan payment schedule with room for shortfall. She paused. If Greer is willing to look at it as evidence. And if he isn't? Then I'll have to find a way to make him, she said. But I'd rather solve that problem when I'm standing in front of him and I can see which direction the resistance is coming from. She made the appointment with First Territorial Bank the next morning by note delivered through the same young man who'd brought the acceleration letter. Greer's response came back by afternoon, Thursday, 10 o'clock. 2 days. She spent those 2 days working, not the contracts. Those were done, organized, reviewed twice, placed in the folder in order from largest commitment to smallest because she wanted the opening numbers to be the strongest. What she worked on was everything else: the hotel mending, 3 new orders that had come in, a jacket for the Halverson Ranch that needed an entirely new lining because the original had finally given up completely. She worked because the work was there, and because it proved, even to herself, that what she was about to walk into that bank and claim was true. She was a businesswoman, not an aspiring one, not a struggling widow who had briefly managed to keep things together. An actual functioning enterprise with demand that exceeded her current capacity and a client base that had formalized its commitment in writing. She said that to herself several times over those 2 days, out loud, alone in the workroom, which felt slightly ridiculous but helped. Owen watched her with an expression of careful attention that told her he understood something significant was happening, even without knowing the specific details. She had not told him about the 45 days. She was not going to tell him unless it became something he needed to know, and she was going to make sure it didn't become that. On Wednesday evening, she asked him to help her press the good dress. The dark gray one, not the black funeral one, because she was not going to walk into Greer's office in a dress that smelled of grief. Owen held the garment flat while she worked the iron over it, and when they were done, he looked at it with a critical eye that was so purely his father's expression that she had to turn away for a moment. "It looks good," he said. "It does," she said. And then, because he deserved something. "Tomorrow is an important day." He considered that. "Is it the bank?" She looked at him. "How do you know about the bank?" He looked at the dress. He looked at the floor. He said carefully, "I heard you and Mr. Briggs talking, on the porch, last week. I didn't mean to." She was quiet for a moment, deciding. "Yes," she said, "it's the bank." "Are you scared?" She thought about telling him no. She thought about what she'd decided all those months ago, about not making promises she wasn't sure she could keep, about telling the truth in the ways she was able to. "A little," she said, "but I'm ready. Those are different things." Owen nodded. He'd had to learn that distinction himself in smaller ways, and she could see he understood exactly what she meant. "Can I come?" he said. "No," she said. He took that without argument, which she appreciated. "I'll be home by noon," she said. "Then we'll eat and I'll tell you what happened." He nodded again. He looked at the dress one more time. "It really does look good," he said. Thursday morning came cold and bright, with a frost on everything that made the world look briefly clean. She dressed carefully. She did her hair the way she would have done it if James were alive and they were going somewhere important. Not elaborate, just neat and deliberate. The kind of arrangement that said, "I have taken care with my appearance because I take this seriously." She picked up the folder from the table. She felt the weight of it. 7 contracts, her name in the headings of all of them, 17 months of projected income documented in figures she had calculated 3 times and checked against the loan balance twice. She had also brought the record of every payment she'd made since James died, every single one, including the partial ones in the bad months, because she wanted Greer to see that even in the worst of it, she had never stopped trying to pay. She walked to the bank. 4 blocks. She did not hurry. Colton was waiting outside when she got there, which she had not known he would be. He was standing on the sidewalk in a clean jacket with his hat in his hands, and when she came around the corner and saw him, she stopped walking for just a moment. "You didn't tell me you were coming," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not coming in, unless you want me to." She looked at him. "Then why are you here?" He looked at her steadily. "Because if he says no," he said, "I didn't want you walking out of that building by yourself." Something moved through her that she did not immediately have a name for. It was not relief exactly, and it was not gratitude exactly, and it was not— she was careful here. It was not the thing she'd been being careful not to let it be. It was something simpler, and in some ways more complicated. It was the feeling of being seen by someone who had taken the care to understand what she actually needed. She needed to walk in alone. She needed to face Greer with her folder and her evidence and her straight spine, and whatever combination of preparation and stubbornness had gotten her to this point. She did not need someone to do it for her or with her. But she had not known, until this moment, that she needed someone to be standing outside when it was done. "Don't come in," she said. "I know," he said. She walked past him and pushed open the door. The young man at the front desk looked up. She said she had a 10 o'clock with Mr. Greer. He nodded and told her to wait. and she sat in one of the chairs against the wall and held the folder on her knees and breathed the way she'd breathed in the bad months, deliberately, one at a time, staying in the moment she was in instead of running ahead to the moment she was dreading. Greer kept her waiting 9 minutes. She counted. When she was finally shown in, she sat in the low chair and placed the folder on the edge of his desk. Not in her lap, where it would be hers, but on the desk, where it was already a statement of intent. And she looked at Harold Greer and said, "I have something I'd like you to look at before we discuss the acceleration clause." Greer looked at the folder. He looked at her. He reached for the folder. He opened it. She watched his face while he read. He was a man who had trained himself not to show what he was thinking, which was a useful skill in a banker, and also, she had found, a reliable indicator of when something was landing, because when something surprised him or changed his calculation, the absence of expression got very slightly more deliberate, like a man consciously holding a face instead of naturally wearing one. His face got more deliberate on the second page. She let him read. She didn't explain. She didn't rush. She sat straight in the low chair with her hands folded in her lap, and she let the folder make her argument for her, because she'd spent 3 days making sure it could do exactly that. When he'd gone through all 7 contracts, he closed the folder and placed it back on the desk and looked at her. "This represents," he paused, doing the arithmetic, "17 months of documented income at rates exceeding the remaining loan payments." 18 months for 4 of them, she said. 17 for the rest. I've included the projection on page 8, but the short version is this. The loan will be repaid in full, on the original schedule, from these contracts alone, without touching my per-piece income or my accounts receivable from this month. Greer looked at the folder again. He didn't open it. He was just looking at it, the way people look at things when they're recalibrating. "These are ranch families," he said. "If there's a bad season—" "Lars Halverson has been in operation for 20 years, she said. "Patrick Connolly inherited a debt-free property. Clara Peterson has maintained her ranch through her husband's illness for a full year. These are not speculative clients." She paused. "And I've built in a default clause that reverts to per-piece pricing rather than voiding the contract if either party faces hardship. It protects them, and it keeps my income stream intact." Greer looked at her. The quality of that look had changed since she'd walked in. Not warmly. Greer was not a warm man, and she didn't expect that. But the particular indifference had shifted into something more like attention. He was actually looking at her now, not at the problem she represented. "The acceleration clause was invoked based on prior payment irregularity," he said. "In the months following my husband's death," she said, "before I had established the current income level. The history since I established the business." She reached over and opened the folder to the last section. "Consecutive full payments, no exceptions." He looked at the payment history. He turned a few pages. He closed the folder again. There was a silence in the room that was not comfortable but was, she felt, honest. She sat in it and did not try to fill it, because filling it would have been conceding that it made her nervous, and she was nervous, but that was not Greer's information to have. Finally, he picked up his pen. He made a note on a pad at his elbow. He looked at her. "I'll need to have the contracts reviewed by our credit assessor," he said. "Standard procedure for this class of documentation." "Of course," she said. "That will take until Monday." He looked at her. "The acceleration deadline is Saturday." She met his eyes. "Then I'd suggest scheduling your assessor for Friday," she said. "I've brought original signed copies. You can keep them. I have duplicates." Something moved very briefly across Greer's face. She would have missed it if she hadn't been watching carefully. It might have been surprise. It might have been the slight adjustment of a man who has underestimated someone and is recalibrating for the second time in 10 minutes. He made another note. "Friday," he said. 2 o'clock. "My assessor will have a decision by end of business." "I'll be here," she said. She stood. She picked up her bag. She left the folder on his desk because those were his copies and turned toward the door. "Mrs. Ashcroft." She stopped, turned back. Greer was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not kind, not warm, but something in the range of measured. "Your husband was a good man," he said. "He spoke highly of your work." She looked at him for a moment. "I know he did," she said. "He was right." She walked out. The front room, the young man at the desk, the main door. She moved through all of it at the same pace she'd come in, because she'd promised herself she wouldn't let the relief hit until she was outside. She pushed through the door into the cold, bright morning. Colton was where she'd left him. He looked at her face, and she looked at his, and she didn't say anything for a moment because she was still holding herself together by the same habit that had gotten her through the last several months. And old habits did not just dissolve because the hard part might be over. Friday, she said. The assessor reviews the contracts. Decision by end of business. Colton looked at her. That's not a yes, he said. It's not a no either, she said. And it's a long way from where we started this morning. He nodded. He looked at her steadily, and she looked back, and neither of them said the other things. The things that were still in the air between them. The things that had been building since a saloon in late September, and a boy who couldn't take his eyes off a plate of food, and a man who'd noticed. Not today. Today had used up everything she had. I need to go home, she said. I told Owen I'd be back by noon. I'll drive you, he said. She almost said no. She caught it in time. All right, she said. They walked to where he'd left his horse, and she matched his stride without thinking about it, and the cold morning sat around them clean and still, and there was still Friday ahead of them, and whatever Friday brought. But she had walked in, she had made her case, she had left the folder on his desk. And Harold Greer, for the first time since her husband died, had used her name at the end of a conversation instead of at the beginning. That was not nothing. That was not nothing at all. Friday came in gray. Not raining, not snowing, just that particular Montana gray that settled over everything like a held breath. The sky the color of old pewter, the light flat and directionless, the kind of morning that didn't commit to anything. Maeve had been awake since 4. She knew she'd been awake since 4 because she'd watched the clock on the mantel move from 4 to 4:15 to 4:30 before she'd stopped looking at it, and then she'd lain in the dark running numbers and conversations and contingencies through her head until the room began to get its pale pre-dawn color and she heard the first birds, which was her signal to stop pretending she was going to sleep again and just get up. She made coffee. She stood at the kitchen window and drank it while the light came up slowly over the yard. And she thought about the folder sitting on Greer's desk and the assessor who would be looking at it this morning and the 2 o'clock meeting that would determine whether the work of the last several weeks had been enough or whether she would find herself, by end of business today, in a position she hadn't let herself fully imagine. She had imagined it anyway, at 4 in the morning. That was the thing about lying awake. You ended up in the places you'd been avoiding. Owen came out at 6:30. He was still in his nightshirt, and his hair was doing something complicated on one side. He looked at her and at the coffee and at her face, and he said nothing for a moment, just pulled out his chair and sat at the table with the particular patience of a child who has learned to wait for the right moment. Is today the day? He said. Yes, she said. 2 o'clock? She looked at him. You've been paying close attention. He looked at the table. I heard you telling Mr. Briggs. On Wednesday. Through the window. She sat down across from him. She thought about telling him to stop listening through windows. She decided it wasn't the morning for that. Yes, she said. 2 o'clock. Greer's assessor will have looked at the contracts, and then Greer will tell me whether the acceleration clause stands or whether it's going to be restructured. Owen processed this. What does restructured mean? It means he agrees to go back to the original payment schedule, she said, instead of demanding everything at once. And if he doesn't? She looked at her son. She had promised herself she would tell him the truth in the ways she was able to. Then we have some harder decisions to make, she said. But I don't believe it will come to that. Because of the contracts? Because of the contracts. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, looking at his hands on the table. Then he looked up. I want to come to the bank, he said. Owen, I know you said no before, he said quickly, before she could finish. But it's different today. I want to be there. I don't want to be here by myself not knowing. He stopped. He took a breath and steadied his voice the way she'd watched him learn to do over the last months, this small person teaching himself the same things she'd had to teach herself. I won't say anything. I won't touch anything. I'll just be there. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about 6 years old and standing in doorways calculating whether she was all right. She thought about a boy who wrote 4 careful sentences to a man who had treated him like a person worth talking to. She thought about the fact that this was his life too. His house, his future. the world that had been upended when the mine foreman knocked on the door, and that she had been trying to protect him from it when maybe what he needed was not protection, but inclusion. "Get dressed," she said, "and do your hair." He was out of the chair before she finished the sentence. They were at the bank at 1:40. She had not been able to make herself wait until 2. Sitting in the house was worse than doing anything, and she told herself that arriving early was professional, not anxious, which was partly true. The young man at the front desk looked at her and then at Owen and then back at her, and she said she had a 2 o'clock with Mr. Greer and she would wait. She sat in the chair against the wall. Owen sat beside her. He was wearing his best clothes, the ones she put on him for important occasions, and his hair was properly done. He sat with his back straight and his hands on his knees and did not fidget very much, which she appreciated, and she thought that whatever the next hour brought, her son would not watch her go through it from a distance. At 2 o'clock exactly, the young man came back and showed them in. Greer's office felt different from Thursday. She noticed it immediately. Not the room itself, which was the same, but the arrangement of the room. There was a second man present, older than Greer, heavy-set, with a pair of reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the paper-stained hands of someone who spent significant time with ledgers. This was the assessor. He was seated to the side of the desk rather than behind it, which she read quickly. He was not the decision-maker in this room, but he had information Greer wanted visible. The folder was on the desk. She could see that pages had been marked with small slips of paper, the assessor's annotations. She tried to read the density of the markings without being obvious about it. Dense annotations could mean thorough examination. They could also mean problems. She couldn't tell which. Greer looked at her. He looked at Owen, briefly, without expression. Owen looked back at him with the careful, neutral face of a child who has been told not to say anything. "Mrs. Ashcroft," Greer said. "This is Mr. Aldis. He's handled our credit assessments for 12 years. She nodded to Aldis. He nodded back. His expression was professionally neutral in the way of a man accustomed to delivering news in both directions. Greer opened the folder. "Mr. Aldis has reviewed the contracts." "Yes," she said. "He has some observations." Greer looked at Aldis. Aldis cleared his throat. He picked up the top contract, the Halverson one, she noted, and looked at it through his reading glasses. "The documentation is thorough," he said, in a voice that was somehow both complimentary and preliminary at the same time. "The client base is established, most of these relationships predating the formal contract by at least 6 weeks, which provides operational history. 8 weeks for Halverson and Peterson," she said. 11 for Tully. Aldis looked at her over his glasses for a moment. "Yes, I noted that." He set the contract down. "My concern is the concentration risk. 7 clients is a meaningful number, but if 2 or 3 of the larger contracts were interrupted, seasonal difficulty, a bad year. I've accounted for that," she said. "Page 8 of my projection includes a stress scenario where 3 contracts underperform by 20%. The loan still covers." She looked at him directly. "I built the stress test in because I wanted you to see that I'd thought about the downside." Aldis looked at Greer. Something passed between them. Fast, professional, the kind of glance that carried a full sentence. Greer picked up his pen. "Mrs. Ashcroft," he said, "I'm going to be direct with you." "Please," she said. "The acceleration clause was invoked in part due to a specific conversation I had with an interested party regarding this property." He said it flatly, without apology, which she had not expected. "That party has since withdrawn their interest, for reasons unrelated to you. That changes certain calculations on our end." She looked at him. She absorbed this. The land buyer had withdrawn. She had not known that. She did not know why, and she would find out later, from Colton, who had learned it through his supply man, that the buyer had discovered the land carried a water rights complication that made development impractical and had quietly moved his attention elsewhere. This had happened 3 days ago. Greer had known it when she walked in Thursday and had not mentioned it. She made a decision in the space of 2 seconds. She was not going to show what that information did to her. Not here. She would feel all of it later, privately. The rage at having been moved around like a piece on someone else's board. The relief that the game had changed. The complicated fury of a woman who had spent 45 days building a fortress against an attack that had partly been engineered for reasons that had nothing to do with her debt. She would feel all of that later. Right now she kept her face exactly where it was. "I see," she said. Given that, Greer continued, and given the documentation you've provided, I'm prepared to rescind the acceleration clause and restore the original loan terms. She breathed, one breath, controlled. Additionally, he said, now his voice had a slightly different quality. Not warmer, but careful. I'm prepared to offer a 30-day payment holiday, given the disruption of the last 6 weeks. No interest accrual during that period. Aldous was writing something in the margin of a form in front of him. She looked at Greer. Why the holiday? She said. He looked at her. Because the bank's position contributed to an unnecessary hardship, he said. He said it the way he might have said that the weather contributed to a road being impassable, factually, without drama. That's not how this institution conducts business. She sat with that for a moment. She wondered if he meant it. She decided it didn't entirely matter whether he meant it. What mattered was that the clause was being rescinded and the terms were being restored, and she was sitting in this chair with 7 signed contracts on his desk, and she had done this herself. That was what she would carry out of this room. I accept the original terms, she said. The payment holiday as well. Greer nodded. He picked up the pen. He began writing, and that was when the front door of First Territorial Bank opened and Dale Purcell walked in. She heard his voice before she saw him. Dale was a man who talked at one volume in all situations, which was the volume slightly above what a room required, not from aggression, but from a lifetime in loud environments. She heard him ask the young man at the desk for Greer, and she heard the young man's voice go uncertain, and then she heard more voices, plural, and she turned in her chair to look through the glass panel beside Greer's door. The front room of the bank was filling up. Not packed, not yet, but there were people coming in from the street, 4 of them, then 6. She recognized Lars Halverson's height at the back. She recognized Reuben from the Briggs Ranch, which meant Colton was either there already or coming. She saw Clara Peterson, which surprised her enough that she almost stood up, and Clara was talking to a woman she recognized from the general store, and the woman from the general store was talking to someone else. Greer had looked up from his writing. His expression had shifted into something she'd never seen on his face before. Uncertainty. What is this? He said. She had no idea. She genuinely had no idea, and she turned back to the glass panel and looked again. And there were more people now, maybe 15, and Dale Purcell was at the front desk apparently explaining something to the young man with increasing volume. The young man knocked on Greer's door. He opened it without waiting. Mr. Greer, sir. There are people... I can see that, Greer said. They're asking about the Ashcroft account, sir. Greer looked at Maeve. She looked at Greer. Neither of them had expected this. Give me a moment, Maeve said to Greer. She stood and walked to the door and opened it fully and stepped into the front room, and the low hum of conversation in the room settled when she appeared. Dale Purcell was at the front. His face was red from the cold, and he still had his work coat on, which meant he'd come straight from somewhere without stopping to change. Maeve, he said, we heard the bank was... He stopped. He looked past her at the still open door to Greer's office. He recalibrated. We heard there might be a problem today, with the account. She looked at the room. Lars Halverson, Clara Peterson, Reuben. The woman from the general store whose name was Frances, and who had given Owen a peppermint stick in September when he'd come in with Maeve to buy thread, and she'd quietly put it on Maeve's tab because she knew Maeve had not had the change for it. The hotel manager who had told her 3 months ago he couldn't help her. 3 of the ranch hands from the Connolly place. 2 women she recognized from a sewing circle she'd attended exactly twice before James died and never returned to. Colton was in the back. He'd come in quietly. She'd missed him arriving. And he was standing near the door with his hat in his hands. And when she found his face, he gave her the smallest nod, which told her he had not organized this. He had not organized this. She turned back to Dale. Where did you hear that? She said. Frances, Dale said, tilting his head toward the general store woman. She heard it from the McGraw boy. He heard it from... Dale waved his hand. You know how this town works. She did know how the town worked. She also knew that this gathering was not going to be what she needed it to be unless she handled the next 5 minutes correctly, because there was a difference between people showing up out of concern and people showing up in a way that accomplished something, and right now what was happening was just people in a room. She turned back to Greer's office. He was standing in the doorway. He had his pen in his hand. He was looking at the room with the expression of a man who understood that the balance of a conversation had shifted in a direction he hadn't planned for. She walked back to him. She did not lower her voice. "Mr. Greer," she said, "I'd like to finish our meeting." Greer looked past her at the room. He looked at her. She held his gaze. She let the room be what it was. Not a threat, not a performance, just a fact. The way the contracts were a fact. Harlan Creek was watching. These were the people who moved money through his bank, who held accounts here, who conducted business in this county. They were watching him in his doorway with a pen in his hand and a widow in front of him. And she was not going to use that to push him in any direction because she didn't need to, because she had already made her case, and what this room represented was not pressure, but truth. The truth that she was not a liability. She was a person in a community that had decided, imperfectly and belatedly, and in the slightly chaotic way that communities do things, to show up. She just needed him to finish what he'd started writing. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. He stepped aside and gestured toward the chair. She sat down. She folded her hands in her lap. Owen was still in his chair beside her, very still, watching everything with wide eyes and saying absolutely nothing, which was the best thing he could have done, and she was going to tell him that later. Greer sat. He picked up his pen. He finished writing. He turned the document around and pushed it across the desk to her. She read it. It was exactly what he'd said. Original terms restored, acceleration clause rescinded, 30-day payment holiday, both parties to execute. She read it twice because she read everything twice. She took her time because the room outside was still full of people, and there was no reason to rush, and also because her hands were not entirely steady, and she needed a moment before she picked up the pen. She picked up the pen. She signed. Greer signed. Aldis signed as witness, with the practiced efficiency of a man who had signed many documents and found them all equally unremarkable, which in this case she found oddly comforting. Greer stacked the papers. He kept one copy. He slid the other across to her. She picked it up. She put it in her bag on top of the duplicate contracts. She stood. She straightened her dress. "Thank you, Mr. Greer," she said. "Mrs. Ashcroft," he said. And then, with the smallest pause, the kind that meant something was being said that would not be said again, "Your work is evidently sound." "It is," she said. "It always was." She walked out of his office and into the front room, and the room went quiet when she came through the door. That particular hush of people who have been waiting and now don't know what the news is and are reading her face for it. She looked at the room. She looked at Dale Purcell and Lars Halverson and Clara Peterson and Francis from the general store and Ruben and the hotel manager and all the others whose names she knew and some she only recognized by sight. All of them standing in a bank on a Friday afternoon because someone had heard something and told someone else, and somehow that had become this. Owen appeared beside her. He had come out of Greer's office without her noticing and was standing at her side looking up at her. And she looked down at him, and he was trying very hard not to ask with his face, and failing. She put her hand on his shoulder. She looked back at the room. "The account has been restructured," she said. "Original payment terms. The machine stays where it is." The room exhaled. Dale Purcell said something under his breath that wasn't entirely clean language, and then looked sideways as if checking whether Francis had heard, which she clearly had, and Francis looked somewhere else deliberately. Lars Halverson nodded with the measured satisfaction of a man who had driven 20 minutes for this information and felt the trip had been worth it. Clara Peterson did not change expression, but her shoulders came down about half an inch. Colton, at the back, caught her eye. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Owen said very quietly into the silence that followed, "We get to keep everything?" "We get to keep everything," she said. He made a sound, not the unguarded laugh she'd heard through the workroom window at the ranch, but close to it. He pressed his face briefly against her arm, just for a second, and then straightened up and looked at the room with an expression of enormous dignity that was both heartbreaking and funny. And she heard Francis from the general store make a small sound that might have been a suppressed emotion of some kind. People started to move, the way rooms do when the central tension has resolved. Conversations starting up, coats being readjusted, the slow drift toward the door. Dale Purcell shook her hand with both of his in a way that was more feeling than a handshake usually contained. Lars Halverson came and said simply, "Good," and that was all, which was right. Clara Peterson squeezed her arm, once, briefly, and didn't say anything, and Maeve understood exactly what that meant. The hotel manager stopped in front of her. He was a small man who looked uncomfortable in his own skin at the best of times, and right now he looked like a man who wanted to say something and was trying to find the shape of it. "Mrs. Ashcroft," he said, if you have capacity in the spring for the hotel linens, I should have asked you months ago." She looked at him. She made him wait one beat, not out of cruelty, but because she was human and she'd sat across from his turned-down offer 3 months ago, and one beat felt fair. "Come by the shop in March," she said. "We'll talk about rates." He nodded, grateful, and moved toward the door. Colton was the last one. The room had mostly cleared by the time he made his way over, and it was just the three of them, him and Maeve and Owen, who had found a chair near the window and was watching the street outside with the look of a boy who has had a very big day and is starting to feel it. Colton looked at her. "You did it," he said. "I did it," she agreed. Not defensively, just accurately. The contracts. The contracts. He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't organize that," he said, tilting his head toward the now mostly empty room. "What happened out there?" "I know," she said. "I could tell." "I told Reuben," he said, "that there might be something happening at the bank today. I didn't ask him to come. I just—" He stopped. "I thought he should know." "And Reuben told someone," she said. "Evidently Reuben told several someones," Colton said. Something about how he said it was almost dry, almost amused, in the way of a man who is relieved enough that the relief has a slightly absurd edge. She looked at him. "You told him because you wanted people to know, in case it went wrong. So I wouldn't be alone when I came out." He looked back at her. "In case it went wrong," he said. "But it didn't go wrong." "No," he said. "It didn't." She could have said more about that. She didn't, because there was still something between them that neither of them had named, and she was not going to name it in a bank on a Friday afternoon with her son 12 feet away, and also because naming it required being ready for what came after the naming, and she was not ready for that today. Today had been enough. What she did instead was look at him steadily, long enough that he understood something had shifted, and she saw him understand it, and they left it there for now. "Owen," she said, turning, "get your coat." Owen slid off the chair. He picked up his coat from the arm of it. He'd hung it there himself, she noted, without being told, which was new, and began putting it on. He got the left sleeve backwards and fixed it himself without comment. She looked around the bank. The young man at the front desk was watching them with an expression of mild bewilderment, as if he was still processing the afternoon's events. Greer's office door was closed. She picked up her bag. She walked to the door. Colton held it open. The three of them stepped out into the gray afternoon, and the cold came at them clean and even and completely indifferent, the way cold always was. Owen immediately looked up at the sky. "Do you think it's going to snow?" "Maybe tonight," Maeve said. "Real snow or just a little?" "I don't know, Owen. Because if it's real snow, I want to be outside when it starts." "Then you'd better get home and do your evening chores before it gets dark," she said, "so you have time." He considered this logic and apparently found it satisfactory, because he picked up his pace. Colton fell into step beside her. She was aware of the exact distance between them. Not close, not distant, just the natural distance of two people walking together who were not pretending to be less aware of each other than they were. She was going to think about that later. She was going to think about a lot of things later, in the quiet after Owen was asleep and the lamp was low, and she had the signed document in the box with the other important papers. "What does Monday look like?" Colton said. "For work." The question was so normal, so deliberately ordinary, that it took her a half-second to adjust to it. She appreciated him for that more than she could have said. "I've got the Halverson coat to finish," she said. "And there's a new order from the Connolly Ranch, a full set of winter covers for the hay storage. That'll take most of the week." "I've got 2 blankets need replacing," he said. "Not repair, full replacement. The fabric's past saving. Bring them Thursday," she said. "I'll look at what I have in stock for the weight." "Thursday," he said. They walked on. Owen was ahead of them now by about 20 yards, moving at the energized pace of a child who has decided he wants to be somewhere and is going there. He turned once to check that they were still behind him, found them, and turned back. She watched him and felt something that was large enough that she didn't try to reduce it to a single word. On the walk home, she thought about James. Not with the raw bruise press of the early months, but the way she'd been thinking about him more recently, which was different, cleaner. She thought about the singer, sitting in the corner of the workroom, solid and patient, doing exactly what he'd believed it could do. She thought about how he would have handled today. James had been a man of big feelings and quick warmth, the kind of man who would have hugged Dale Purcell in the bank and made everyone laugh. And she missed that about him, missed it specifically, the way he could make a hard thing into a story people would tell later. She thought he would have liked what today became, even if he'd never have been able to sit still through the waiting. She thought he would have liked Colton Briggs, which was a thought she let herself have for the first time. She had been avoiding it, because having it felt like something she needed permission for that she could only give herself. She let herself have it now, walking down the main street of Harlan Creek with her bag on her shoulder and the signed document inside it and her son 20 yards ahead, and it felt like something opening rather than something ending. At the edge of the street, where the road turned toward home, Owen stopped and waited for them to catch up. When they reached him, he fell in between them, one on each side, and he walked that way for a block without saying anything. Then he said, "Mr. Briggs?" "Yeah," Colton said. "Is it true that horses can tell if you're scared?" A pause. "Where'd you hear that?" "Reuben." "Reuben's not wrong," Colton said. "They read your body more than your face. If you're tense, they're tense." Owen processed this. "What about if you're just nervous? Is that different from scared?" "Depends on the horse," Colton said, "and depends on why you're nervous. Some things you can breathe through. Horses can feel when you're doing that too, when you're trying to steady yourself. A good horse will steady with you." Owen was quiet for a moment, then, "I think that's like people too." Neither of the adults answered right away. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was the kind of silence that has something solid inside it. "I think you might be right," Colton said. They turned onto the road home, the three of them, and the gray sky had started to do something. Not quite snow yet, but working toward it. The air with that particular cold weight that meant the night would bring something. Owen was scanning the sky with the concentrated hope of a child waiting for the first flake, and Maeve walked with her hand not quite near enough to Colton's arm to be a decision, just near, and the evening came down quiet and cold around them, and behind them in the town, in a building she would not set foot in again. Until she walked in to make a payment. There was a signed piece of paper in a file that said her name and the word restructured and a date, and it was the most ordinary, extraordinary document she'd ever seen. She had walked in. She had put the folder on the desk. She had sat in the low chair and made her case with her own words and her own numbers and the work of her own hands, and she had walked out with what she'd come for. It had not been clean. It had not been simple. There had been a man who'd made a mistake with good intentions and admitted it, and a room full of people who'd shown up imperfectly and late but shown up, and a banker who'd done something expedient and called it principle, and a boy who'd told his mother he wasn't really hungry when he was, and a woman who'd kept working when there was no good reason to believe the work would be enough. It had been enough. The first flake came down just as they reached the front gate. 1, then 2, then 3. Owen made a sound of pure, uncomplicated joy and turned his face up, and the snow came down on it, and he stood there with his arms out and his eyes closed and his mouth open, and for a moment he was just a child again, completely and without reservation. Maeve stopped walking and watched her son stand in the first snow of winter, and the feeling she'd been carrying all day. The tight-coiled readiness, the careful management, the holding it together, released from her chest in one long, quiet breath. Just one breath. That was all she let it be. Then she was herself again, steady and clear-eyed, the same woman who had walked into that office this morning. But she'd breathed. That was something. The snow that started that Friday evening did not stop until Sunday morning. It came down serious and committed, the way Montana winter always eventually announced itself. Not gradually, not politely, but all at once, as if the season had been waiting just past the tree line and had finally decided enough was enough. By Saturday morning, there were 8 inches on the ground, and Owen had been outside twice already, both times coming back in with red ears and wet sleeves and an expression of complete satisfaction that no amount of cold could diminish. Maeve let him go. Both times. She stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and watched him move through the white yard and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly, which was a word that had felt too large and too fragile to use for most of the past year, but something adjacent to it, something that didn't require her to brace against it. She spent Saturday finishing the Halverson coat. She worked at the table with the lamp on even in the afternoon because the snowlight was flat and strange, and she listened to Owen come in and go out and the wind move against the house, and her hands did the work they knew, and she let her mind rest for the first time in weeks. Not emptied out. Her mind didn't empty. It was not built that way, but quieter. The arithmetic that had been running constantly in the back of her head, the debt calculations and the timeline and the contingency planning had gone quiet for now, and in the quiet she could hear other things. The sound of the needle pulling thread through wool, Owen's boots on the porch, the way the house settled in the cold little creaks and shifts that she'd stopped noticing when James was alive and had started noticing again after he died and had gradually, over these months, come to think of as the house just talking to itself, which was something old houses did. Sunday the snow stopped. The world came back white and specific, everything outlined, the trees along the fence line holding their shapes in white. Owen stood on the porch in his coat and looked at it with the expression of a person surveying something they feel proprietary about, which she found funny in a private way she kept to herself. Monday, she delivered the Halverson coat. Lars Halverson's wife Dora looked at the finished lining and ran her thumb along one seam and made a sound of approval that meant more than most compliments because Dora Halverson was not a woman who approved of things easily. Halverson paid her the agreed amount and then added a small extra, which Maeve almost refused and then didn't, because she'd decided, somewhere between Friday's bank meeting and this Monday morning, that she was going to stop treating the acceptance of fair value as a threat to her independence. The extra was not charity. It was a man saying the work was worth more than the contract rate, which was different, and she was going to let herself know the difference. She picked up 3 new orders that week, the Connolly canvas work, which she'd known was coming, a coat repair from Clara Peterson, which arrived by cart with a note in Clara's direct handwriting. Left sleeve, you'll see it, CP. She saw it. The seam had been badly repaired before, probably by someone trying to save money on a simple fix who had made it worse, which was a thing that happened with mending, the way it happened with most things people tried to do too cheap. She fixed it properly, which took twice as long as a surface repair, but meant it would hold. And a new order, unexpected, from the hotel. Not the spring linens the manager had mentioned, but an immediate order for 24 napkins monogrammed with the hotel's initials, which told her he'd already decided he trusted her before he'd even come to talk rates. She did not feel triumphant about any of this, exactly. Triumph felt like the wrong word, too dramatic for the simple fact of work coming in and work getting done. What she felt was something more like solidity, like the ground under her feet was, for the first time in over a year, actually the ground, and not something she had to keep testing with every step. The first payment under the restructured terms went in on the scheduled date. She walked to the bank herself, as she always had, and handed the envelope to the young man at the front desk, who took it and gave her a receipt. Greer's door was closed. She did not knock on it. There was no reason to knock on it. The arrangement was documented and the payment was on time, and that was the entire relationship, which was exactly the relationship it should be. She walked out into a January morning that was cold enough to make her eyes water and felt perfectly fine. It was in January also that she started thinking about the shop. The idea had been in the back of her mind for a while, since the contracts, maybe earlier, maybe since the afternoon in the saloon, when Colton had said he had 20 men whose gear needed attention, and she'd thought, briefly, that's a full business, and then set the thought aside because the immediate problem had been so large that anything beyond it was luxury thinking. But the immediate problem was no longer immediate. And the workroom at home, which had been sufficient for one woman working odd hours on whatever came in, was no longer sufficient for the volume of work she was managing. She'd been spreading canvas across the kitchen table to get enough space. Owen had eaten 3 dinners this week with his plate balanced on his knees in the front room because the table was occupied. She mentioned it to Colton on a Thursday, not as a request and not as a plan that needed his input, but because they had gotten into the habit of talking, and this was something she was thinking about, and talking about things she was thinking about had become part of what they did. There's a space on 4th Street, he said, between the printer and the feed store. It's been empty since October. She looked at him. You know what spaces are empty on 4th Street? I know what's empty on most streets, he said. My supply man passes through twice a week. Your supply man seems to know a remarkable amount. He's paid to notice things, Colton said. It's a useful quality in a person. She thought about the space on 4th Street. She'd walked past it, actually. A narrow storefront with a good front window and a back room that looked, from what she could see through the glass, to be roughly the size of her current workroom, but without the kitchen and the sleeping child and the constant negotiation for table space. I'd need to look at it, she said. I know the man who owns the building, Colton said. I'm not asking you to. I know, he said. I'm telling you a fact. You can talk to him yourself. I'm just saying I know who he is. She looked at him. He looked back at her with that steady expression that had stopped being hard to read some months ago, somewhere between the co-signature conversation and the bank on Friday and all the Thursdays in between. She could read it now. He was offering information, not management. He was drawing the line himself this time, without being told where it was. Who is he? She said. The building owner was a man named Birch, who ran a small property portfolio and whose wife, it turned out, had been one of the women at the bank on Friday afternoon, one Maeve had recognized by sight without knowing her name. Mrs. Birch apparently had told her husband about it in some detail, because when Maeve came to look at the space on 4th Street, Birch shook her hand and showed her around with the straightforward efficiency of someone who has already made up his mind and is confirming details. The back room was bigger than she'd estimated from the street. The front window faced east, which meant good morning light. The floor needed work. There were boards that had gone soft near the back wall where something had leaked at some point. But the bones of the place were sound, which was what mattered. She could work around soft boards. She couldn't work around a bad roof or a rotten frame. She negotiated the rent herself. She knew what she could pay, she knew what the space was worth, and she came in with a number that was fair and below his asking price and explained, clearly and without apology, why her number was the right number. The floor repair that would be her cost, the improvement in foot traffic that a working business would bring to the building, the length of the lease she was prepared to commit to. Birch listened. He countered. She came up a small amount, he came down a small amount, and they arrived at a place that neither of them loved completely and both of them could live with, which is what a fair negotiation looks like. She signed the lease on the 2nd of February. She told Owen that evening. He was sitting at the kitchen table, the actual kitchen table, because she'd cleared it, because she'd been thinking about this moment and had prepared. And she put a cup of warm milk in front of him and sat down across from him and told him she was going to open a shop. He looked at her with wide eyes. Where? 4th Street, between the printer and the feed store. He processed this. Can I come see it? Tomorrow, she said. He drank his milk. He thought, will you take the singer? Yes, and I'll need to get a second machine eventually. She paused. But not yet. One thing at a time. He nodded. Then he said, will you have someone helping you? She'd been thinking about this too. Maybe, she said. In time. He nodded again. Then, with the particular careful deliberateness of a child about to say something he's been working toward for a while. Mrs. Peterson's girl is good at sewing. She showed me a thing she made once. A bag. It was pretty even. Maeve looked at her son. Clara Peterson's daughter was 14, which she knew because she'd met her once when she'd delivered work to the Peterson ranch. A quiet girl with careful hands who had watched Maeve work with focused attention. You noticed that, she said. She's not always busy, Owen said, and they could use the money. Mrs. Peterson told Reuben. She looked at him for a long moment. Her son, who had started this year standing in doorways watching her face for signs of collapse, was now paying attention to what other people needed and filing it away in case it became useful. She didn't know quite what to do with that. I'll think about it, she said. Okay, he said, and finished his milk. She thought about it. She talked to Clara, who received the idea with her customary absence of visible emotion, and then said yes before Maeve had finished making the offer, which told her Clara had been thinking about something like this herself. The girl's name was Nell. Nell Peterson started 2 days a week in March, at first just assisting, pressing seams, organizing supplies, running things to and from the back room. And within 3 weeks it was clear she had an eye for it. Real eye, not politeness. She could spot a tension problem in a stitch from 3 feet away, and when Maeve showed her how to address it, she did so the right way the first time, which was how you learned something actually instead of just learning how to approximate it. By April, Nell was handling the simpler repairs independently. By May, Maeve had started teaching her the heavier canvas work. By May also, the first loan payment had been made for the fourth consecutive month on time, which meant the remaining term was a number she could see the end of. Not soon. There were still months ahead of her, but visible. Like a road that disappears around a bend, but you know where it comes out because you've seen the map. The shop had become what she'd known it could be, because she'd been honest with herself about what it was and what it needed. It was not elegant. The floor in the back still had two soft spots she'd covered with a board she hadn't had the money to replace yet. The front window catch was temperamental and required a specific upward pressure combined with a lateral push, which she'd explained to Nell twice and which Nell still occasionally fought with. The sign above the door said Ashcroft and Compon, fine mending and custom work, which she had paid for herself. And the & Co was optimistic for a two-person operation, but she'd put it there anyway because she believed in where the thing was going and not just where it currently was. People came. Not all at once, and not without the occasional lean week, but steadily, in the way that a reputation built on actual quality builds. Slowly, and then more quickly once it reaches a certain mass. Frances from the general store sent women who came in for alterations. The hotel ordered linens twice more. 3 new ranch families not in the original 7 signed work contracts for the following season. A woman named Hester, who was getting married in June, brought in a dress that needed taking in and left with more work done than she'd asked for because Maeve had seen a problem in the bodice the woman hadn't noticed yet and had fixed it without charging extra, and Hester had told 6 people about it within a week. There is a kind of work that sells itself when it is done honestly and well. It doesn't need a voice. It just needs to hold up and hold up and hold up until enough people have felt it hold up that the reputation becomes its own advertisement. That was what Maeve had built. Not with charm. She was not a charming woman in the conventional sense. She was too direct for that. She said what she meant in terms that left little room for misunderstanding. But with something that people felt in the work itself, some quality of care and precision that communicated. I took this seriously because you are worth taking seriously. People felt that. They came back. Colton came by the shop on a Thursday in April. Not for work, just to stop in, which was something he'd started doing in the weeks since she'd opened, usually briefly, usually on his way past for something else. She suspected the something else was sometimes invented, but she didn't say so. She wasn't certain enough to say so, and also she had found that she did not mind the Thursdays when he came by. This Thursday he came in and looked at the shop the way he always did when he came in, taking in the state of it, the work on the table, Nell in the back pressing a seam, and then he looked at her, and he said without building toward it, "I've been thinking about something." "All right," she said. He looked at his hat, which he was turning in his hands. It was something she'd noticed about him. He was a man who held his hat when he was deciding how to say something. He was never in a hurry, but when the hat came out, you knew the thing he was about to say had weight. "I've been thinking," he said again, and then stopped. He looked at her. "This is not me trying to manage anything. I want you to know that before I say it." "I know the difference," she said. He looked slightly relieved. "I've been thinking that I'd like to spend more time around you," he said. "And Owen, in a way that's honest about what it is. Not work arrangements, not dropping by." He paused. "I'm not a man who's good at talking around things, so I'll just say it. I'd like to court you, Maeve. Properly. If you're willing." She looked at him. The shop was quiet. From the back room she could hear the small sounds of Nell working, the hiss of the iron, the soft movement of fabric. She'd known this was coming. She had not let herself know that she'd known it, because knowing it required being ready to answer it, and being ready to answer it required having done the internal work of deciding what the answer was. She had done that work, quietly, in the months since January. She'd done it alone, at the kitchen table after Owen was asleep, in the particular honest way she did most things, without sentimentality, without rushing toward what she wanted to feel, but also without refusing to feel it when it arrived. She had loved James. She had loved him completely, and he was gone, and grief was real and did not require defending or explaining. But grief was also not a life plan, and she was not a woman who had built back everything she'd built back in order to stand still. "You're not a man who's good at talking around things," she said. "I just said that." "I know. I liked it." She looked at him steadily. "I'm willing," she said, "but there are things I need you to understand before we start." He waited. He was good at waiting. I'm not going to stop being who I am, she said. The shop, the work, the way I make decisions. That doesn't change because there's a person next to me. I know that, he said. And Owen's opinion matters, she said. He's not a child to be managed around. He's part of this. I know that too, Colton said, and the way he said it told her he did. Not as a concession, but as something he'd already accepted and didn't need to think about. She looked at him for a moment longer. There were things she could have said, complicated things, about what it meant to start something after losing something, about the way love the second time was slower and more careful, and also, she suspected, deeper in some ways because you knew more about what it cost. She could have said all of that. She didn't, because he already understood it, and because the space between them had gotten to the point where some things could be left to the space itself. Thursday, she said. Come to supper. I'll tell Owen. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but what lived just before one. Thursday, he said. He put his hat on and left. Nell appeared in the doorway from the back room with an expression of elaborate unconcern that fooled neither of them. The seam's done, Nell said. Good, Maeve said, and went back to work. Owen, when she told him, did what Owen did with important information. He went very still and thought about it with his whole face for a long moment. Then he said, Is he going to be around more? Yes, she said. He thought some more. At supper and things? Sometimes, she said. And he'd like to spend time with you. That's part of it, too. That's not nothing. That's actually the main part. For him. Owen looked at the table. He looked at the window. He said, with the directness that was so much his father's and also, she had to admit, hers, I already like him. I know, she said. Is that okay? He said. To already like him? She reached across and put her hand on his briefly. More than okay? She said. He nodded. He seemed satisfied with this. Then he said, Will he teach me more about the horses? You could ask him, she said. Thursday. By summer, the second loan payment was done. By fall, she had paid 3 months ahead because there had been a good run of work in August, and she'd made the decision to put the surplus directly against the principal rather than holding it, because there was no interest in the world that worked in her favor by leaving money idle when it could be reducing debt. Greer received those payments without comment, which was the correct response, and Maeve received her receipts and filed them and continued. Nell had gone from 2 days to 4. There was real talk now of a third person in the new year. Not Maeve's idea alone, but Nell's as well, because Nell had the ambition of someone who had found something she was good at and could see what it was becoming. They talked about it practically, the way Maeve had learned to talk about hard things, what the finances required, what the shop could support, what the training timeline would look like. It was not a conversation Maeve had expected to have with a 15-year-old, but Nell was not quite an ordinary 15-year-old, and Maeve thought of herself at 15, already stitching better than most adults she knew, already understanding that skill was something nobody could take from you, and she thought that Nell deserved the same information she would have wanted at that age. Colton came to supper on Thursdays, and then on some Saturdays, and on the occasional Sunday when the ranch work allowed. He and Owen had a running project that Maeve was not entirely involved in, something to do with a section of fence on the south side of the Briggs property that Owen had become invested in for reasons that seemed to have started with a question about post depth and expanded into an education in how fences were built and why good ones lasted and bad ones didn't. She heard about it in segments, the way you hear about things children care about, in fragments and asides, and the occasional full report delivered at the supper table with the seriousness of a man presenting findings. Colton sat at her supper table on a Thursday in October, the first snow of the season just threatening at the edges of the sky, the way it had threatened last October, and Owen was telling him about something at school involving a dispute over whether a certain type of knot was faster to tie than another type. And Colton was listening with genuine attention, not performing interest, and Maeve sat across from both of them and watched and felt the things she had been careful about feeling too quickly all these months, felt it clearly and without apology. This was her table. These were her people. This was a life she had rebuilt from the ground, with her hands and her stubbornness and her machine in the corner, and it was not the life she had planned, and it was not without its seams and its soft boards and its temperamental window catches. But it was real, and it was hers, and she had not let anyone take it from her, and she had not built it by becoming someone other than who she was. She thought about the morning the foreman came to the door and she'd folded the dish rag into neat squares. She thought about the too-low chair in Greer's face, and the burned biscuits, and Owen's hunger in the saloon, and the 72 hours that had felt like a wall she couldn't see over. She thought about all the moments where it could have gone the other way. And there had been many of those moments, real ones, where the margin had been thin enough that a different choice or a different day could have tipped everything. She thought about what she knew now that she hadn't known then, that asking for help and accepting help and deciding what kind of help to accept were not the same thing as surrendering to it, that a person could be dependent and independent at the same time, in different measures for different things, and that the balance between those two was not weakness. It was just being alive, being a person in the world who needed other people the way people did. She had spent a long time believing that needing people was a crack in the foundation. She understood now that the foundation was made of it. She also knew, and this was the harder knowledge, the one she'd had to sit with longest, that she had not been easy during any of this. She had been prickly and proud and sometimes inflexible past the point where inflexibility was serving her, and she had nearly let her own stubbornness close doors she needed to walk through. The version of herself that would have refused Colton's offer of work in the saloon, or refused the Thursday after, or gone into the bank without the contracts because asking for the contracts felt like depending on relationships. She hadn't built herself. That version had been wrong. Not wrong to have her pride. Wrong to treat pride as identical to dignity. They were not the same. Pride was about the self. Dignity was about what you could live with looking back at you in the mirror. And she could live with accepting help that had been offered honestly and used honestly, with her own effort meeting it halfway. Owen settled the knot debate, apparently, by announcing that it depended on the conditions of the rope, which Colton confirmed was accurate, and which Owen received with the satisfaction of a child who suspected he was right, and has now had it verified by a person he respects. "How do you know about ropes?" Owen asked him. "Grew up using them," Colton said. "Before I had a ranch, I had about 3 years where everything I owned fit in a bedroll, and I needed to know how to tie things to other things reliably." Owen looked at him with wide eyes. "Where did you go?" "A lot of places," Colton said. "East of here, north. Worked for other people's outfits until I had enough to start my own." "Were you ever hungry?" Owen said. It came out the way Owen's direct questions always came out, without calculation, just wanting to know. Colton was quiet for just a moment. He looked at Owen steadily. "Yes," he said, "plenty of times." Owen absorbed this. "That's why you gave us your food," he said. Another pause. "Partly," Colton said. "Partly it was just that it was the right thing to do, and there wasn't a good reason not to." Owen considered this. "Mama says those are usually the same thing." Colton looked across the table at Maeve. She looked back at him. "Your mother's right," he said. She looked at him for a moment, and then she got up to get the coffee, which was what she always did at this point in the evening, and the ordinary movement of it, getting up, crossing the kitchen, lifting the pot, felt like its own kind of grace, not the word she would normally have used, but the right word for the thing she was feeling, which was something like gratitude without the ache in it, which was different from all the gratitude she'd felt before, which had always carried some ache. She was not going to call it perfect. The floor in the shop back room still needed fixing. The Connolly contract was up for renewal in January, and she wasn't certain they'd renew at the same rate. There were things between her and Colton that were still finding their shape, questions she hadn't answered, and things she hadn't said yet. Owen was 7 now, and would be 7 for exactly 3 more months, and then he'd be 8, and time moved whether you were watching it or not. But she was watching it. That was the thing that felt different from a year ago, when she'd been so deep inside the survival of each day that watching it had felt like a luxury. She was watching it now. She was in it, actually in it, not just managing her way through it. She poured the coffee. She brought it back to the table. She sat down. Outside, the snow had started. Just a few flakes at the window, the season beginning again, the year turning, the way years did. Owen noticed before either of them and turned to look and said, "It's snowing," with the same uncomplicated joy he'd felt last year, which was the thing about children that she had stopped taking for granted. The ability to feel something the same way twice, to not have the first time hollow out the second time. She hoped he kept that. She intended to try to make sure he had the kind of life where he could. Colton reached across the table and set his hand over hers, briefly. Not a statement, not a performance, just a hand over a hand, warm and certain. She turned her palm up and held it. The snow came down outside and the lamp burned on the table, and the singer sat in the corner of the front room where it had always been, solid and heavy and indifferent to everything except the work put through it. And the coffee cooled in its cups while nobody moved to drink it, and the kitchen was warm, and the year turned, and they stayed at the table a little longer than they needed to. That was enough. More than enough. That was everything.